Am I the bad guy for cutting ties with my family? After years of being overshadowed by my disabled sister's needs and feeling invisible, I wonder if I am the bad guy for cutting ties with my family. Emily, my younger sister, has always been the center of my family's existence. Even though she is just a year younger than me, it seems like she lives in a completely different universe that is solely centered on her. Because Emily was born with a physical disability and ongoing health problems, her life has been filled with doctor's appointments, treatments, and special accommodations. Naturally, my parents devoted nearly all of their time and energy to making her life as easy and happy as possible. Nevertheless, it also meant that I was abandoned at a very young age. I took on the role of the easy and healthy kid, which came with the expectation that I needed less care and upkeep. I learned early on not to worry about it because Emily's needs always came first. I would nearly always stay behind when Emily couldn't, either at Aunt Linda's or with a neighbor, depending on Emily's ability to cope. They would frequently say, "We will bring you next time," but I never felt like it would happen. I didn't just miss the big family holidays. Emily was almost always at the center of even the small, everyday activities, like going to the park, buying ice cream, or watching a movie with the family. Sometimes I could comprehend it logically, but it still hurt emotionally. Her needs always came first, and even though I was excited about the idea of us all doing something together, I felt unattainable. The first time I truly felt the weight of being forgotten was on one of my birthdays. I must have been 8 or 9 years old by then. There was no cake, no celebration, and no acknowledgement of the day. I woke up that morning with the thought that maybe, just maybe, something unexpected was in store for me. However, as the day went on, it became very evident that my parents had completely forgotten my birthday. Their main goal was to get Emily to a concert that she had been anticipating for several months. They talked enthusiastically about the performance when they got home, and as I listened, I questioned if they were even aware that it was supposed to be my special day. It wasn't until the next morning that my mother realized her error. Even while I appreciated the gift card she hurriedly grabbed as an afterthought, it was painfully obvious that the excitement of Emily's concert far outweighed my birthday in their universe. For many years, this pattern persisted. My parents constantly focused on Emily, and I was expected to accept that being understanding at all times, avoiding conflict, and blending in while everyone else's needs were taken care of was a heavy burden for a young child. I felt more noticed and appreciated when I was by myself or at a friend's house, so I started spending more time there. A year ago was my 10th birthday. For weeks I had been hinting that I wanted to do something fun, like go to the arcade or throw a pizza party. It was significant to me because I was finally getting close to double digits. However, it became very evident that nothing was scheduled. I wanted them to surprise me, but I forced myself not to get excited. Maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. On the morning of my birthday, however, there was no celebration. There was no mention of it during breakfast, and the day went by like any other. Emily was the center of attention because she had been having a rough week with her health. Even though I knew she required more attention, I still felt disappointed. My school friends wished me a happy birthday and even collected some money to buy me ice cream for lunch. It was a small thing, but it made the day seem less empty. I thought maybe my folks would remember when I got home that afternoon. However, the house was silent, and my mother was on the phone setting up Emily's next therapy session. My father was still working. It should come as no surprise that no one acknowledged that today was supposed to be mine. Trying to make the most of it, I went to my room. What was the point of saying anything? It wouldn't make people remember, and it certainly wouldn't make them feel sorry. The following day, my mother finally realized she had missed my birthday again. She apologized and explained how busy she had been with Emily. As usual, I nodded and claimed it was all right, but it wasn't. Even though I knew in my heart how things would work out, they assured me that we would make up for it that weekend. I desired to have faith in them. We stayed at home during the weekend, though, because Emily wasn't feeling well enough to go out. Rather than celebrating or doing something special for me, we watched her favorite movies. As an afterthought, my dad brought home a store-bought cake, but by that point it felt more like a consolation prize than a celebration. It served as yet another sobering reminder that in my home Emily's needs and desires always came first. By the time I turned 12, I had given up on having any dreams. I didn't focus on making any requests or offering any agenda suggestions. I spent the entire day playing video games, doing my homework, and helping out around the house. That year my parents did remember to wish me a happy birthday, but it was a brief acknowledgement before everything was back to normal. That day, Emily went to see another doctor, and she was the center of attention again. That birthday hurt the most, even though it wasn't particularly awful, not because of anything noteworthy, but rather because of how typical everything was: habitual neglect as opposed to malicious neglect. My needs barely registered, since my parents were so accustomed to giving Emily all of their attention. They neglected not just my birthdays, but also my accomplishments in school, my hobbies, and the things I held dear. The acknowledgement was swiftly followed by dismissal. Resignation, hardened by disappointment, led me to stop expecting something different. As I grew older and realized that this was just the way things were, celebrations of friends' birthdays began to act as a reminder of what might occur at home. However, the story was consistently the same. As the years went by, I became accustomed to my invisibility. My parents constantly seemed to be somewhere else, so I learned to have modest expectations. It wasn't that they didn't care about me in their own way, even though Emily's requests were always more urgent, more immediate, and somehow more important. I started to emotionally distance myself, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. It was easier to be satisfied with coming in second, third, or not at all, and it was easier to not expect anything. During all of this, my grandparents were my lifeline. They were the ones who noticed the small details about me and gave me a sense of importance. Every time I went to their house, I felt like I had entered a different realm where I could see myself. Making everything unique was something my grandmother was particularly skilled at. Each time I went to see her, she let me pick out something to bake. No matter what we made, cookies, cupcakes, or even simple spaghetti, she had an old recipe book that was worn and battered. Her kitchen was our thing. My childhood was filled with joy on such afternoons. She made sure I understood that I was more than just another kid. I was her grandson. Grandpa, however, was the reserved type. Although he didn't say much, he was trustworthy and always present. He loved model trains. His basement was crammed with tracks, little houses, and miniature scenery. I loved how he included me in something he enjoyed, not because I was a train enthusiast, but because it was the only area where I didn't feel like an afterthought. I spent hours down there with him. My grandparents complimented me on every small achievement I made that my parents didn't notice. After I scored my first soccer goal, Grandma prepared a special dinner and baked a cake. Grandpa even put the ball I used in the game in a small display in the living room. They made it feel like a huge deal in their home, even though it was just a local soccer match. It was important to them because it was important to me. However, such pleasant things are always taken away by life. It was 3 years ago that Grandma fell unwell. It was a long fall, reflecting the slow erosion of my childhood happiness. It wasn't abrupt. She continued to attempt baking with me at first, but as her condition worsened, our sessions shifted to my sitting next to her bed and holding her hand as she slept. Long before she was gone, I missed her. Her death truly broke my heart. It felt like losing everything when I lost the one person who gave me a sense of belonging. The funeral went very quickly. There were many faces expressing sorrow, but it didn't feel genuine. Although Grandma was no longer with me, it felt more like a piece of me had died. After that, Grandpa changed. His once warm eyes became aloof. Our visits decreased, and he stopped hanging around with his trains. What had been my sanctuary felt chilly and empty now because the house was too full of memories. Eventually, Grandpa went into a nursing home in a different city. I could understand why it was sold, but it still felt like another aspect of my youth had been lost. It wasn't the same when we went to see him once a month. The antiseptic visitor's room lacked the coziness that had previously made our time together memorable, and our visits were short. We were both unable to mend the raw wound caused by Grandma's absence. The barrier against the loneliness I experienced at home disappeared after Grandma left and Grandpa moved far away. Everything became controlled by Emily's needs and life resumed as it had always been. The contrast, however, was suddenly even more noticeable. My grandparents made me visible, while my parents had unintentionally rendered me invisible. It was absorbed by every family decision, every discussion, and every medical procedure concerning Emily. My words appeared to disappear as soon as they left my lips. When I tried to discuss friends or school, it seemed like they weren't picked up. I became more reclusive at home and typically declined friends' invitations to hang out. It was easier to avoid questions about why I felt the need to pretend everything was all right or why I was always so miserable. Everyone was aware of Emily, of course, but nobody had any real idea what it was like to live in her shadow. Since Emily did not select her health problems, I felt ashamed, but that did not make the actual suffering of neglect any less genuine. Specifically, the guilt was awful. I felt terrible because I wanted more attention, and I was upset that Emily was constantly given priority. Feeling important was more important than merely getting attention. Despite my parents' best efforts, I still felt like I was peering in from the outside. At this point, I brought up family therapy for the first time, but I had no idea what to anticipate. I thought I would give it a shot. My parents consented, much to my surprise. Maybe they thought a professional could help close the growing distance between us, or maybe they didn't know what else to do. In any case, we were seated in a calm office with a therapist who appeared sincere and wanted to hear from each of us. We started going to therapy sessions on a regular basis. I was a little optimistic at first that things might get better. I was finally able to communicate what I had been experiencing for a long time. Early on in those sessions, I expressed my desire for them to take notice of my hobbies and recognize my achievements, as well as how it felt to be the one neglected. It had been a while since I felt like my parents were actually paying attention, or that they recognized the profound impact their deeds or lack thereof had on me. They appeared taken aback, possibly even shocked. Tears, apologies, and vows to improve were exchanged. For a few moments, we appeared to be moving forward. My parents paid closer attention and were more considerate. They found time for me alone, for things that weren't Emily's purview. We went bowling, saw a movie, and visited a museum. Even though it was unpleasant at first, it felt great to be the center of attention for a brief while. But Emily was aware of the shift. Since she wasn't used to sharing the limelight, her jealousy quickly surfaced. Small remarks like how much fun we must have had without her, or how wonderful it was for her to have some alone time at home, were the first subtleties. However, those comments quickly became more intense. One night, she sobbed throughout dinner, saying my parents were favoring me and ignoring her. According to her, the reason they loved me more was that I was normal. My parents were shocked by the accusation and hurried to console her. We started to lose the delicate equilibrium we had been establishing. We stopped going on family vacations as often, and when we did, Emily's jealousy took center stage. My parents went back to their old methods because they couldn't decide whether to include me or manage Emily's emotions. It quickly became evident that I was only living in Emily's reality once more. I felt bad for disturbing things, so I proposed that we resume our regular routine. I decided that accepting my position on the sidelines would make things simpler for everyone. However, our therapist disapproved of that notion, reminding us that the purpose of treatment was to disrupt these negative habits rather than strengthen them. Even though it seemed like we were going nowhere, we persisted. The majority of our sessions were dominated by Emily's sentiments of envy and abandonment. Even in therapy, which was meant to benefit all of us, she continued to take center stage. Despite my frustration, I failed to find a solution. One session reached a breaking point when Emily accused my parents of loving and preferring me more. My parents went into a self-doubting, guilt-ridden spiral after the accusation. The progress we had been making was compromised as they rushed to reassure her. It was tiring to see the same patterns being repeated over and over. I started to question whether continuing therapy was really necessary. I was exhausted. I was simply exhausted and no longer upset. I'm tired of attempting to articulate how I feel and of holding out hope that things will improve. I began withdrawing once more, both from the treatment sessions and from my family. I started to lose the tiny hope I'd been holding on to, the hope that perhaps things could be different. I came to terms with the fact that this was the way life would be. Therapy had become just another ritual in which I expressed my emotions, only for Emily's desires and sentiments to take precedence over mine. My parents couldn't come see me since they were too involved in Emily's life. I accepted that information as true. I had lost my anger. I had exerted every effort to draw their attention to me and help them comprehend what it was like to be ignored. However, it was obvious that they were set in their ways, and I was out of energy to challenge it. I started to completely stop going to therapy. What use was it to repeat the same things over and over again if nothing was going to change? My parents were aware of my increasing distance, but they were unsure of how to respond. They seemed to be only going through the motions when they tried to interact with me, whether they inquired about my day or made awkward attempts to strike up a conversation over dinner. There was no genuine connection. My withdrawal was also observed by Emily. She had a mixed response. On the one hand, she was glad that she was once again the center of attention. There were still a lot of questions on the other hand. She didn't know how to connect, and to be honest, I didn't either. By this point, we were both unable to overcome the hurdles that had been put in place by years of mistrust and misunderstanding. I began focusing on my studies and personal hobbies. I made friends, joined groups, and concentrated on things that had nothing to do with home. It was comforting to be surrounded by people who knew Emily yet recognized me for more than just her sibling. I came to understand that I didn't need my family's approval. By spending more time at school and with friends, I could establish my own identity without having to worry about my sister's demands. One day, during a particularly difficult therapy session, everything came to a head. I had been listening in silence as the therapist brought up Emily's sentiments of envy and desertion once more. She was always the focus. I had made an effort to speak up earlier in the session, describing how it felt to be repeatedly ignored. However, the topic quickly returned to Emily's difficulties. I was used to it at this point, yet it seemed different that day. Perhaps it was the years of frustration building up. I paused the session after taking a deep breath and told them everything. I had the impression that my family was looking straight through me, how I had given up on the idea that things would be different, how Emily's needs always came first, and how birthdays, accomplishments, and little moments had become meaningless. I described how agonizing it was to watch them defend the necessity of the current situation and how I had finally realized that nothing would change. The room was quiet after I was done. My parents were surprised, as if they were unaware of how deeply I was hurting. The harm was already done. Even though the therapist made an effort to steer the discussion in a more constructive direction, my parents defended themselves rather than owning up to the damage they had caused me. They discussed how difficult it was to balance everything, how important Emily's health was, and how they were trying their hardest. Emily joined in, saying I was attempting to make her feel awful over something she couldn't control. She accused me of being selfish for seeking attention. I wasn't surprised by what she said, even though it hurt. the hidden lesson that my feelings were not as significant as hers was one I had heard before. The therapist made an effort to diffuse the situation, but the damage had already been done. That's when I knew nothing would change. My parents were unable to see past Emily's needs, and Emily was only able to see her own difficulties. I never really succeeded in making room for myself, so I was caught in the center. For me, that session was a turning point. I made the decision to stop trying to make things better. I kept being caught between Emily's and my own demands. After that, I was simply worn out. I had lost my anger. Peace was what I desired. The conflict was no longer interesting. I became progressively more reclusive during the following few weeks. I concentrated on my studies, looking for internships, college scholarships, and any opportunity to travel far from home and be independent. At last, I started searching for distant colleges where I could start over without having to worry about the dynamics of my family. I craved distance both physically and emotionally. Even though I loved my family, I rejected my parents' suggestion that we consult a different therapist to get a different viewpoint. I had given up on attempting to fix anything that was too damaged. Despite their apparent disappointment, they didn't press the issue either because they were growing weary of the never-ending battle or because they were starting to realize that some wounds couldn't be healed. However, Emily didn't appear to notice that I was withdrawing. She was once again the center of attention, and she was perfectly content with it. Every now and again, she would inquire about my plans, but our discussions never progressed past the obvious. I didn't see a way to close the distance between us now that we had drifted apart. I became more and more preoccupied with my future. I applied to colleges, visited college campuses, and focused on getting ready for life beyond high school. My grades improved, my friendships grew stronger, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was making progress toward a personal goal. I was creating a life apart from Emily, my parents, and the never-ending cycle of letdowns. In the end, I received acceptance to a college in a different state. I could travel home if necessary, but it was still distant enough for me to be independent. When I told my parents, they were pleased for me, but I also felt sad. They must have seen that this was my method of bidding farewell to the family dynamics that had continuously molded me. They made no effort to persuade me to remain closer to home. I felt as though a burden had been removed when I left home. The independence that came with living alone thrilled me. As I settled into college life, the distance from home transformed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The freedom was intoxicating, like stepping out of a heavy fog into a vibrant world brimming with possibilities. I reveled in the quiet of my dorm room, which was a far cry from the chaos of my childhood home. Classes were a refreshing change. I was immersed in subjects that sparked my curiosity: psychology, literature, and philosophy. I found solace in the written word, spending hours in the library, lost in novels and essays that spoke to my experiences and emotions. I began to discover parts of myself that had long been overshadowed. My professors recognized my passion, encouraging me to pursue my writing more seriously. I joined a creative writing club and found camaraderie in fellow students who shared similar struggles of identity and expression. It was invigorating to be seen for who I was, rather than as a reflection of someone else. Making friends came naturally, too. My roommates were a diverse group, each with their quirks and backgrounds. We often spent late nights laughing over takeout, debating everything from our favorite movies to our aspirations. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of belonging that wasn't contingent on anyone else's approval. I was no longer defined by my sister's health struggles or my parents' well-meaning but suffocating attentiveness. I was simply me, an ambitious student, a budding writer, and a friend. But despite this newfound joy, there were moments of longing. I missed the connection I used to have with my parents, especially during family events or holidays. The weight of Emily's absence at the dinner table during those occasions was palpable. I received occasional texts from my mom, updates on Emily's health and small family news. Each message felt like a reminder of the life I had left behind, but I was learning to handle the complexities of my feelings. I felt a blend of nostalgia and relief. The past was part of who I was, but it didn't have to dictate my future. One evening, while sitting in a cozy coffee shop with friends, I noticed a group of students discussing their families. They shared stories of holidays filled with laughter, of sibling rivalries that ended in playful banter, and of parents who celebrated their achievements with pride. A pang of envy struck me. I glanced down at my mug, the steam rising like the unexpressed feelings I had tucked away. I realized that while I was creating my own life, as the semester progressed, I decided to write about my experiences. I poured my heart into my writing, exploring themes of family dynamics, identity, and the search for self. Each word felt like a release, a cathartic way to process the tangled emotions that had long been simmering beneath the surface. I submitted my work to the college's literary magazine, feeling both nervous and excited. One crisp autumn afternoon, I received an email that made my heart race. My piece had been accepted for publication. Elation surged through me, but it was accompanied by a hint of fear. Would my family read it? Would they understand? It was a snapshot of my truth, raw and unfiltered. I decided to share it with my parents, hoping they would see the journey I had taken. I composed an email, carefully choosing my words, conveying both my love for them and the realities I had faced. I hit send, my heart pounding as I waited for their response. A few days later, I received a reply. My mother's words were gentle and apologetic. She expressed her pride in my accomplishments, but also her sadness at how far apart we had grown. My father echoed her sentiments, acknowledging their shortcomings and their struggles to balance Emily's needs with my own. In that moment, something shifted. I felt a flicker of hope. They were starting to see me not as a background character in Emily's story, but as the protagonist of my own life. I decided to call them, my heart racing as the phone rang. When my mom picked up, I could hear the warmth in her voice. We talked for hours, diving deep into the unspoken feelings we had each been carrying. It was as if a dam had broken, allowing us to share our fears, regrets, and aspirations. The conversation marked the beginning of a new chapter. We agreed to keep the lines of communication open, making an effort to share more about our lives. I found myself sharing the mundane details of college life, the people I met, the classes I loved. In return, they kept me updated on Emily, who, despite her ongoing challenges, seemed to be finding her own footing as well. Emily's situation, however, was still complicated. I learned that she had started attending therapy, encouraged by my parents. Though I was relieved that she was getting help, a part of me worried about her jealousy resurfacing. I couldn't deny the scars that years of living in her shadow had left on me. I still held on to the hope that she could find her own path. During one of my visits home, I saw Emily in a different light. She had grown more articulate about her feelings, and for the first time, we found ourselves having an open conversation about our lives. We talked about our frustrations and dreams, and I felt a flicker of connection. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental, a step towards understanding and perhaps healing. Over the following months, our family dynamics continued to shift. My parents made conscious efforts to create space for both of us. They encouraged Emily to express her feelings while also validating my own. I began to see the possibility of us finding a new equilibrium. Though the road was still bumpy, I was no longer just the sibling in the background. I was carving out my own narrative, and Emily was learning to do the same. College became a sanctuary for me, a place where I could explore my identity free from the constraints of my past. I threw myself into my studies, and my writing blossomed. My work was featured in the college magazine, and I even participated in readings, sharing pieces that resonated with my journey. Each performance felt like a reclaiming of my voice, an affirmation that I was worthy of being heard. As the year drew to a close, I felt a sense of accomplishment wash over me. I was preparing for a summer internship. I could see the path before me, and it was bright with potential. Though my relationship with my family was still evolving, I had learned to appreciate the complexities of our shared experiences. We were all navigating our challenges in our own ways, but now there was room for understanding and growth. When I returned home for the summer, I was met with a different atmosphere. My parents seemed more relaxed, and Emily appeared more confident in her own skin. We spent time together bonding over movies and shared meals, and I could sense a newfound connection. It felt surreal and comforting, a glimpse of what our family could be. As I looked toward the future, I realized that while the past had shaped me, it didn't have to define me. I was no longer just Emily's sibling. I was becoming a person in my own right, with my own dreams and aspirations. And as we moved forward, I held on to the hope that we could build a family dynamic that honored each of us, our struggles, our victories, and our shared love.